Virtual greetings, everyone. This is a lecture that I'm recording for the Introduction to Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness course. This week's class is focused on process philosophy. And in this lecture, I both want to sort of take a step back initially and ask the question, what is philosophy? Before we would want to jump into so-called process philosophy, it might be helpful to just gain a sense of orientation around what philosophy is. And unfortunately, I can't ask you in advance of my lecture what you think philosophy is, but I hope we can engage in discussion um, this week in the Canvas forum, where you'll have an opportunity to offer your own understanding of philosophy and indeed your reactions, responses, questions about what I have to share with you in this recording. So I want to ask that question, what is philosophy? And then from there go into the history of what I am calling process philosophy. And I'm not the first to do so. There is a school of thought that is referred to as process thought, process philosophy, sometimes process relational philosophy. It's mostly coming out of the 20th century mathematician and philosopher Alfred North Whitehead's work, but in discussing the history, I hope to show that really Whitehead is drawing on the whole history of Western philosophy, and in some ways um, offering an integral vision of the issue of or the product of that tradition in his own process philosophy, which inevitably is offered to us as a product, as a set of texts. At least our reading was for Modes of Thought for this lecture. He's offering us a set of texts. That's what's left for us to study in Whitehead's work, but he offers it as an open system, as a set of conceptual codes that we're supposed to hack, that we're supposed to tinker with, experiment with, test in the arena of our own experience, and adjust them if they seem inadequate in any way. Um, so, yeah, we'll go into philosophy as such, then history, and then we'll end with an exploration of the basic outlines of Whitehead's cosmology. So, what is philosophy? This is, of course, an ancient question, and we might even want to say that it's a prehistorical question, a primal question, in the sense that to be human, to be conscious, is in some sense to be a philosopher. So, at this most general level, to be a philosopher is to engage life with an attitude of curiosity, an attitude of inquiry, but also, inquiry can sometimes imply a sort of nonchalant, observational witnessing without a sense of being actively, um, driven with purpose to participate. And so I think philosophy is not only this desire to step back and observe, but also there's a practical component to it, right? Um, the philosopher is engaged in an activity and is trying to change the world, not just understand it. Of course, Aristotle famously said that philosophy begins in wonder, and in the reading for this week's lecture in Whitehead's book Modes of Thought, which was one of his later works, Whitehead himself alludes to Aristotle by saying, yes, philosophy begins in wonder. And Whitehead adds, at the end, when philosophic thought has done its best, the wonder remains. So the goal of philosophy is not to explain away wonder, it's to engage with wonder. And Whitehead goes on to say that after wonder has been engaged philosophically, there has been added some grasp of the immensity of things, some purification of emotion by understanding. So philosophy begins and ends in wonder, but in between, the goal is to elucidate our experience of the mystery. Now, there are other conceptions of philosophy. Some may view philosophy as the endeavor to construct or to reveal perhaps an encyclopedic system of absolute knowledge, which reveals not only what is true in general, but what is true in detail about every specific instance and particular fact, that every fact will find a place in the form of the whole, and that the philosopher is the really tasked with becoming wise. And in fact, the goal of philosophy would be to become wise, not just to be the friend of wisdom, or not just to love wisdom, but to identify with wisdom, to become one with wisdom. This would be what someone like Hegel might envision for philosophy, and it's a noble goal. Some would say that it's a bit hubristic. I am not sure where I would come down on that. I feel myself, if I'm honest with myself, driven to um, pursue wisdom, right? I think anyone with a philosophic attitude is driven to pursue wisdom. It's just a question of at what point, what would drive one to claim the realization of wisdom, um, in various Hindu spiritual paths, in some articulations of Buddhism. We would talk about an idea of enlightenment or nirvana or shunyata, and that notion of becoming enlightened, I think, has its analogy, its parallel in the Western philosophical tradition with this notion of not just loving wisdom, but becoming wisdom, being wise. And that's one way of conceiving of what philosophy is and why we engage in it. Whitehead will tell us that philosophy is not deduction. It's not about logically or mathematically calculating the truth, because really philosophy is the search for premises, right? It's the search for self-evidence. And when we search for self-evidence, we're looking for premises, right? We're looking for the basis upon which we would then construct an argument. For Whitehead, and I would say for the process relational philosopher, philosophy is the search for an adequate description of our experience. And our experience seems to include two fundamental ingredients. On the one hand, there are the universal necessities of existence. And on the other hand, there are the unique possibilities that haunt that existence. So there's both actuality in its totality and the patterns which pervade that totality. And then there's the realm of possibilities, as yet unrealized, but that our experience yearns for or aims at. So this is fact and form, right? These are the two ingredients in our experience that, at least for Whitehead, are the starting points for philosophy, the premises upon which a philosophical system is to be constructed. But while system building is one part of philosophy, there's also this part of philosophy that's more of an attitude, a way of being, a way of life. And Whitehead says that, trying to get at this notion of what the attitude of a philosopher is, he says that as soon as you rest satisfied with primitive ideas and with primitive presuppositions, you have ceased to be a philosopher. The philosopher is always assaulting the boundaries of finitude. And here Whitehead will draw a distinction between two schools of philosophy, what he calls the critical school and the speculative school. And he says that the critical school confines itself to verbal analysis within the limits of the dictionary, while the speculative school of philosophy appeals to direct insight, right, to self-evidence. And the speculative school endeavors to indicate its meanings by enlarging the dictionary, by coming up with new words, with neologisms, with uh, finding poetic expressions that push language beyond the settled norms of, of our inheritance and towards um, novel imaginations of what has never before been articulated. And Whitehead says that the divergence between the critical and the speculative schools of thought is really about it's a quarrel between safety and adventure. And the critical philosopher is more concerned about not being wrong um, than about truth, while the speculative philosopher is less worried about being wrong and more concerned with um, arriving at truth, with the need to continually question, yes, question, like the critical school would, what we believe we know, but not only to question, but to um, engage in an adventure of abstraction, to trust in our mind's ability to know and to penetrate into depths as yet um, not understood, as yet unarticulated. So for Whitehead, the process philosopher's aim, primary aim, is to reverse the slow descent of accepted thought toward the inactive commonplace by maintaining an active novelty of fundamental ideas that illuminate the social system. So philosophy for Whitehead is not merely an academic pursuit. It's not merely about scholarship. It's an active intervention upon social norms in an attempt to disturb and interrupt those norms, to refresh our understanding of what it means to be human, conscious, civilized creatures, earthlings, so that we never rest in dogmatic conception of the universe and our place within it. Philosophy's role is to, as Socrates first taught us, to play the role of the gadfly, to question everything, but not just to question everything, to engage imagination so as to bring forth something new. Um, and, when we engage in um, studying the history of philosophy, which we're going to transition to now, we should do so, or at least I would encourage us to do so with great reverence, but also never being afraid to question, to reject, to reverse and reinterpret. And I think it's important to be willing to reinterpret and to be reverential at the same time, and give the benefit of the doubt to your interlocutors when you're, well, I wish they were interlocutors, but really they can only speak to us through the written word. This ancient lineage of philosophers can only speak to us through their written words at this point, and they're not here to, Plato warned us of the dangers of text. The author is not here to engage us in dialogue. So it might be worthwhile to give the writer, the author of these philosophical texts, the benefit of the doubt. And when you respond to them, I think, you have to do so with the hope that your reader will also give you the benefit of the doubt. And philosophy is always dialectical or dialogical. in the sense that it's a conversation between oneself and others and wisdom. And, as I discussed a bit earlier, there's a danger in identifying oneself with wisdom because at that point, philosophy ceases to be a conversation, a dialogue. It becomes a monologue because one has claimed to have realized wisdom, and so who else would need to speak if the wise one would have complete speech, right? Um, and I think someone like Socrates warned against such hubris, and we ought to heed his warning. So, if that's a bit about philosophy in general, and certainly, I was Whitehead was our guide in that understanding of philosophy, but I wanted to provide that background before getting into a sort of crash course of the history of philosophy, um, particularly process philosophy, going back to the ancient metaphysicians, Parmenides, Heraclitus, moving through Plato and Aristotle, the great Athenian philosophers, then on to, skipping a whole lot of medieval philosophy and going into modern physics to talk about Copernicus's revolution, Descartes, um, Newton, and then the critical response to modern physics from David Hume and Immanuel Kant, and then the German idealists, and then finally into Whitehead's 20th century cosmological scheme. So, to begin with the ancient metaphysicians, the ancient philosophers, Parmenides and Heraclitus, they provide us with this sort of, um, these two pillars of thought. One, Parmenides arguing that reality is one, that being is, and that all apparent motion or change within being is an illusion because being is, and that wholeness, that oneness is all that could truly be real. And the philosopher's job is to see all the particulars of the world which appear to change as mere appearances that, when seen rightly, point to the truth of reality, which is the oneness of all things. Um, so Parmenides is the great thinker of the one, and Heraclitus, on the other hand, this other pillar of thought in the Western tradition at least, argued that becoming is, and that being becomes, that all is flux. Uh, Heraclitus said that this world is an ever-living fire, and it kindles itself into existence and is snuffed out, and then rekindles itself and is snuffed out, and that it does so in regular measure, according to a regular rhythm. Heraclitus is the great thinker of polarities, and he said you cannot step into the same river twice, because it is not the same river, and you are not the same person. And at another level of Heraclitus's vision of the universe was what he called the logos, and the logos is the intelligible ordering principle that doesn't it's not separate from the flux, from the everlasting fire, but it informs the flux. It gives the flux its rhythm. And Heraclitus would say that logos is common to all, right? It's the mind that all individual minds participate in and gain their understanding from. And so Heraclitus, one of his fragments that has reached us, is that logos is common to all, but most people live as though they had their own individual minds. They think that their ideas are their own, that they have their own opinions, and that they're unique in their opinions. And for Heraclitus, and for many ancient thinkers, this logos that pervaded the universe was one. And to the extent that individual human beings know the truth, it's because they're participating in that logos, in that one mind. So logos or reason is shared by all. And to the extent that we have differing opinions from one another, that we argue with one another about our individual beliefs, to that extent we're ignorant of the one truth. We're clearly missing the point, right? So Heraclitus, great process philosopher, but he also has this principle of the logos, of an order that underlies the flux. And that's important to remember. He also says really beautiful things, like that history is a child building a sandcastle by the sea, and that child is the whole majesty of the human being's power in the world. So, you would expect a process philosopher to emphasize the impermanence of things, and here Heraclitus is saying history is a child building a sandcastle by the sea. I love that attitude. It's the attitude of adventure, right? And that we're never going to finally arrive at something fixed and solid and static, but that we're always going to need to be building, creating afresh, in each moment, in each generation, with each rise and fall of a civilization. So Parmenides, the philosopher of being, and Heraclitus, the philosopher of becoming, are the two pillars that Plato tried to build the philosophical temple with. Plato tried to put the roof on these pillars, and in his famous dialogue, the Timaeus, it's a dialogue about the birth of the cosmos. He more or less successfully integrates these two perspectives of being and becoming. Plato articulates his doctrine of the forms, the eternal forms, which provide the originals, which all of the physical things in our sensory world are imitations of. The realm of forms is a realm of perfect archetypes that the divine used as a model to construct our imperfect world out of. This is one of the ways that Plato frames his doctrine of the forms, and that when the philosopher contemplates the physical world, when they participate in the truth of any given thing, it's because they're participating in the form of that thing. And what makes the philosopher special is that they have intuitive access to this realm of forms, which gives them a sort of codex for decoding the world of sensory experience and political social engagement. So Plato had a whole cosmology that he articulated in the physics and in the Timaeus, and a whole ethical and political theory that he articulated in other dialogues. But it's all of these dialogues are really applications of his theory of forms in some way. But Plato had other ideas, like this notion of participation. And participation is the way that Plato talked about how the philosopher's soul participates in or makes contact with, and in a way incarnates, at least into experience, the ideal realm. And when we talk about a beautiful sunset, Plato would say that the form of beauty, the eternal idea of beauty itself, with a capital B, is participating in our experience of a beautiful sunset. And then in that experience, we're elevated to this higher realm of eternal forms. And Plato also had this notion of, in the Timaeus, of order being brought forth in the universe through persuasion, um, the persuasion of divine eros, rather than the imposition of divine will. Um, and implicit in Plato's dialogue, Timaeus, is a bit of a contradiction, you might say, between these two doctrines of order or law, where order in the universe comes from. There's the doctrine of transcendent law, where there is a God that's beyond the universe that imposes order, imposes law onto that universe from the outside. And then there's another doctrine of immanent law, where order emerges through the relationships among the creatures of the universe. And Plato has both doctrines in his cosmology, but he's Whitehead will say that Plato's not a systematic thinker, and so he's generating these different perspectives, right, and not really taking the time to make them cohere with one another. Um, but for the history of process philosophy, at least, this notion of um, order as persuasively brought forth rather than coercively enforced is drawn from Plato. And as an example, Plato will talk about how the orbits of the planets are a result of or an expression of the friendship among the planets, and that it's their love for one another, their friendship for one another, that keeps the planets in their orderly orbits. And Whitehead will run with this analogy in his cosmology by sort of going back to Plato's Timaeus and retrieving the idea of the divine eros and of persuasion as the primary way that the divine participates in cosmogenesis. Then there is Plato's greatest student, um, Aristotle, who, of course, by the time he was lecturing at the Lyceum, was no longer a student of Plato's, but advancing and challenging many of Plato's core ideas. For Aristotle, the forms don't precede this world. The forms are in this world, and forms are these teleological principles within organisms that guide us from our um, seed form to our fully actualized form. So Aristotle would think of forms as sort of embedded in the substances of the world and as expressing themselves teleologically, moving from a seed state through an embryonic development into a finally actualized state. So the paradigm example is the oak seed becoming an oak tree. And this process of development is something that occurs at the level of individual organisms, that it also occurs at a cosmic level, but at the level of the cosmos, um, Aristotle conceived of the world as a finished whole. And it is a kind of organism, but it's an organism that doesn't die and was never born. And it's perfectly ordered, and everything within it is in its right place, seeking the good. That doesn't mean that there aren't, monstrous forms, aberrations that stray from the norm, but those are um, aberrations, right? The norm is for everything to tend towards the good, and there is the divine mind that is constantly moving in this perfect circle, contemplating itself, and that provides the sort of model for the rest of the universe. But because the divine is so perfect for Aristotle, it has no real relationship with the rest of the world. Um, it's an unmoved mover, so it cannot be moved physically or emotionally by anything that happens in the rest of the universe. Um, Aristotle was a thinker who took the Greek language and brought it to its own um, logical conclusions, and in a sense was the first systematic philosopher. He developed what was the perfect dictionary of philosophical concepts, of philosophical logic, that lasted for thousands of years. And part of this was what Whitehead will refer to as the um, substance quality metaphysic, where what there are finally are things with qualities, and there's something essential about everything that makes it what it is, and then there's something accidental, many accidental features of a thing that change over time and can be removed without disturbing the essence. These are the qualities, and the thing itself is a substance. And this is rooted in the grammar of our language, of the Greek language and most Western languages, where you've got a subject and a predicate. Um, and we'll see with Whitehead how his metaphysical imagination um, is unwilling to assume the structure of our grammar as the basis of metaphysics, whereas Aristotle assumed that and ran with it and developed a pretty potent philosophical encyclopedia of sorts, right, that inspired the European imagination for thousands of years. But there came a point um, in the 15th, 16th century where Aristotle stopped being adequate and began to be questioned. You know, in the Renaissance, there was a rediscovery of some Platonic texts, and Aristotle was questioned. And then Copernicus used ancient Greek manuscripts from the Pythagoreans, who had developed their own heliocentric models, and advanced the mathematics a little bit, um, advanced them enough to really secure this heliocentric vision of the universe, and the scientific revolution was born. Copernicus solved Plato's problem of the planets, where Plato admitted in the Timaeus that these planetary bodies, they wander in an apparently disordered way, but of course the universe must be ordered, and so it is an illusion created by our senses that makes the planets appear to be chaotic, when really there must be some mathematical harmony underlying that apparent disharmony. And Copernicus, with a little help from Kepler and Newton, was able to uncover this mathematical harmony. And so the scientific revolution um, occurred, and over the course of a century or so, the imagination of Europeans and their colonies was transformed. No longer was the human being and the earth the center of a static uh, cosmos. The earth was moving. The sun was the center. And indeed, eventually we came to see that the sun itself was at the periphery of a galaxy, and that galaxy was at the periphery of a supercluster of other galaxies. And the story of science has been, in so many ways, the story of the um, never-ending decentering of the human being. What allowed for the scientific revolution to occur was the marriage of mathematical abstraction with highly accurate measurement. So, Copernicus was able to get measurements that were good enough for him to apply this heliocentric geometrical model. Um, Galileo was able to perfect the experimental method so that he could measure balls rolling down inclined planes or falling from towers with enough accuracy that he could apply those measurements to sort of insert them into his mathematical equations, which allowed him to predict the velocity of objects in different circumstances. And Newton really brought this method of mathematical empiricism, we might say, or experimental application of mathematical principles to its height with his theory of universal gravitation. And Newton's fundamental assumptions were this idea of absolute space as an empty container within which material particles interact according to eternally imposed laws, and in fact arbitrarily imposed laws. These material particles are present at an instant, fully present at an instant, and they have simple location, right? So you can point to the location of a particle in absolute space, and that location has a meaning independent of the locations of all the other particles. These are the assumptions of Newtonian cosmology. You know, what gave birth to the Whiteheadian view of the universe was the complete demolition of all of these Newtonian fundamental assumptions as a result of quantum theory and relativity theory. But before we get to Whitehead's cosmology, there's what I would call the Kantian interval, or the Kantian compromise. So if the story of modern science is the progressive decentering of the human being, Kant's transcendental philosophy is, as Kant put it, a Copernican revolution in philosophy, but really it's more of a Ptolemaic counter-revolution. It's a return of the human to the center of things, an inversion of the scientific realist's view of the objective world. So for Kant, he's able to preserve the understanding, the self-conception of science, that it's producing knowledge of nature that is lawful and in fact deterministic and mechanistic. And Kant is able to preserve this religious sense of our moral freedom as individuals and of the immortality of our souls, which from a purely scientific perspective would seem impossible, right? If the human body is a part of nature and the soul is in some sense internal to the body, then it becomes difficult to imagine how it might be possible for the human soul to act freely. Nature knows, science knows nature as determined by law, and yet the human soul is claiming freedom. And the way that Kant is able to pull off the compromise between science's understanding of a deterministic nature and religion's understanding of a free, immortal soul is by erecting an epistemological dualism between the phenomenal world and what he called the noumenal world, or the world of things in themselves, beyond the phenomenal, beyond the apparent world. The apparent world is structured by the categories of our understanding, by the concepts of our mind, and by the forms of intuition that shape our sensory experience of the world. So Kant's inversion is to say to the scientist who assumed that we live in a natural world of objects out there that we can know through, empirical observation and mathematical deduction. Kant says that, well, you think you're knowing an objective world, but really those mathematical ideas and that empirical experience is shaped a priori, or sort of in advance of your experience, by your mind. And the mind comes pre-programmed with a certain set of categories, organized by a certain set of sensory organs that display space and time for us in the way that Euclid understood space geometrically. Um, and time is just a sort of, well, time's weird for Kant, right? On the one hand, for science, it's a measure of change, but time for Kant also pointed to our own inner experience of the continuity of our consciousness, of our identity with ourselves through time. Um, Time is more mysterious for Kant, right? It points to our inner intuition of ourselves. Space points to our outer intuition of the extended world, and that's the realm of science. But the point for Kant is that his key problem, his transcendental inversion of the traditional way of understanding the subject's relationship to objects, is to say that it's not that objects are out there independent of the subject and the subject comes to know them through experience. It's that the subject is structured so as to give rise to a world of objects, and that what we experience is not independent of the activity and the structure of our mind, but a projection of that structure and those activities, those mental activities. So Kant's problem is, what must the mind be such that our experience of nature is possible? And he would say that we just can't have knowledge of what is beyond experience, what is beyond the world as it appears to our mind. And we should stop asking about it. But because we don't have access to that, we can be justified in our claim to be free. While everything we know about apparent nature suggests that it's lawful, that it's deterministic and mechanical, we can be justified in our belief in freedom, in our belief in God, in our belief in immortality, because that knowledge is limited to the phenomenal realm, limited to appearances. And Kant will suggest that our moral experience of freedom is just as real as our scientific knowledge of nature. And he tried to arrive at a compromise that would allow science to continue to advance at the same time that the core intuitions of religion and morality would be protected. Now, this is a kind of Kantian interval, as I called it, because it didn't last. Science continued to advance, and this really sort of complicated, abstract, transcendental inversion that Kant tried to pull off wasn't something that the average person could grasp. And scientific materialism sort of won the day, and we were left with this, as Whitehead would describe it, an enfeeblement of thought, because there was this tremendous, blatant inconsistency in our fundamental way of looking at the world. On the one hand, we would, modern people after the Enlightenment, in their democracies with the rule of law and in their political organizations, we would assume that we were free, that we were moral, that we can take responsibility for our actions. And yet, our best science was telling us that the body is a machine and it's part of the rest of nature, which is similarly mechanical, and that gradually, as we gain more and more knowledge of that machine, we will come to understand the causes and conditions of all human action, such that the idea of a court of law passing judgment upon an individual as a result of their behavior would be nonsensical, because none of us are actually choosing to behave in any particular way. We're just a product of our environment. So, as Whitehead sees it, the Kantian compromise wasn't self-evident enough to win the day. scientific materialism appealed to our common sense perception of objects in extended space. It appealed to our desire to gain ever more technological control over objects in space. And what was forgotten was, or at least sort of pushed to the side, was this need for coherence, this need for integration of our experience of being alive, our inner soul life, and our experience of the outer world, of nature. Whitehead describes this division or bifurcation between our experience of life and our understanding of nature through the lens of mechanistic materialism in this way. This is from the chapter called Nature Alive from Modes of Thought, which we read for this week. Whitehead says, the effect of this sharp division between nature and life has poisoned all subsequent philosophy. Even when the coordinate existence of the two types of actualities is abandoned, there is no proper fusion of the two in most modern schools of thought. For some, nature is mere appearance, and mind is the sole reality. And this is the idealists who came after Kant, like Fichte and Hegel, who viewed the nature known to science as a kind of appearance in the mind of God. And while Fichte was more of a subjective idealist who tried to sort of derive the appearance of a deterministic nature from the free assertion of the ego. There's a whole logic to Fichte's system where in order for the ego to freely assert itself, it has to meet resistance from the outside, and through a dialectical exchange, this idea of a deterministic material nature is derived. There's a lot to Fichte. He's a very deep thinker, and I don't want to dismiss him. Similarly with Hegel, he is a very deep thinker, but is ultimately, as Whitehead would put it here, saying that nature as it is understood to exist by science, as in some sense mind independent, is really just an illusion or an appearance, because mind is the sole reality, or Geist, spirit, as Hegel would describe it. So Whitehead says, for some, nature is mere appearance, and mind is the sole reality. For others, physical nature is the sole reality, and mind is an epiphenomenon. These are the scientific materialists, the reductionists. Here, the phrases mere appearance and epiphenomenon obviously carry the implication of slight importance for the understanding of the final nature of things. Whitehead goes on, the doctrine that I am maintaining is that neither physical nature nor life can be understood unless we fuse them together as essential factors in the composition of really real things, whose interconnections and individual characters constitute the universe. So Whitehead wants to fuse physical nature and life together, such that the fundamental constituents of the cosmos that he the cosmology that he articulates are not inert particles made of dead stuff that is just fully present at an instant and simply located independently from other particles. For Whitehead, the fundamental constituents of the universe become events, or what he comes to call actual occasions of experience. There's no nature at an instant for Whitehead because following quantum theory, it became clear that photons and electrons are energetic events. They're activities, and that it takes a certain amount of time for a photon to be what it is. There's a certain duration required in order for a photon to manifest. And what this entails, what this implies, this notion of duration as essential to nature, is that each moment of existence is not just a sort of dimensionless slice, in the present, which includes nothing of its past and nothing of its future, but rather each moment is spread between past and future, inheriting the past, anticipating the future. And here, this is where experience comes in. Whitehead is a so-called pan-experientialist. Experience pervades nature. So the mind-matter dualism, that separation between nature and life, is erased. Because if there is no nature at an instant, if all of nature takes a certain duration to be what it is, down to the level of quantum events on up, then then experience is basic to nature, because what else is experience in the most general sense than the inheritance of the past and an anticipation of the future? That sense of being stretched between what's already given and what might yet be, that is experience. And Whitehead rejects also this notion of simple location, because being an event means to be in relationship to all other events in the universe. And so each actual occasion of experience is a function of its relationship to all other actual occasions of experience. And, so if we were to talk about this at the level of our own human experience, for me to know who I am, I'm required to enter into and to be in relationship to others. And indeed, who I am is a gift from the others that I have entered into relationship with. And so in each moment of my experience, I'm inhaling the experience of others, integrating it into a unified moment of self-enjoyment, of self-existence. And then in each moment, I'm also expressing my integration to others so that they can breathe me in. So I'm breathing in the experience of others. I'm exhaling my own unique integration of that experience so that others can then breathe it in. And in this way, every experience, or every center of experience in the universe, breathes together, conspires with every other center of experience in the universe. And Whitehead's ontology is musical. His conception of how the parts of the universe interrelate as one whole is it's musical. So individuals are in harmonic resonance with other individuals, and the universe is an orchestra of full of many different kinds of instruments. And over the course of cosmic evolution, new musical scores are achieved, and gradually this cosmic orchestra is able to intensify the beauty of the music that it is playing, because hydrogen atoms learn to play the music of stars, and stars learn to play the music of galaxies, and those original stars play music so intensely that they explode, and through the process of stellar nucleosynthesis, heavier elements are born, which form into new stars. And so a more complicated form of stellar rhythm, or astral music, is born that incorporates these heavier elements born from the first generation of stars, right? And so eventually then planets form around the stars, and the music of the spheres is really starting to flower at that point. And then on some of these planets, molecules begin to dance with one another in these ever more intricate and complex ways, self-organizing into plants and animals and conscious human beings with complicated social organizations, and all of it is musical, right? All of it is about rhythm and resonance, and frequently beings fall out of resonance, and there's a collapse of the harmony that had been achieved for a time. But in the course of cosmic evolution, there's a clear trend, a clear tendency toward ever more complex, ever more intense, experientially intense forms of organization and orchestration. And um, this cosmic harmony, this cosmic music is something that Whitehead is trying to call us to participate in, to recognize that human consciousness is not an anomaly in the universe. Human consciousness is an expression of the universe. And to the extent that we are free moral actors, the universe itself must be at least capable of expressing itself in a free and moral way. It's not that at every stage of evolution there was the same level of moral freedom being expressed as there is now in human beings, but there was some form of longing and yearning at every stage of the evolutionary process for the type of freedom that human beings believe that we possess. Whitehead replaces modern physics' obsession with mechanism with a novel conception of organism. He calls his philosophy the philosophy of organism. He's critical of modern epistemology and its focus on sensory experience. He contrasts what we would normally refer to as sensory perception with bodily feeling or bodily reception, and he attempts to correct for the overemphasis of modern consciousness on our visual experience by directing us back to our more visceral experience of, on the one hand, our intuitive connection to our environment, the way that when we walk into a room, before we've discriminated its details, we already have we've already internalized a feeling for it, either, at the vaguest level, oh, I like this, or oh, I want to get out of here. And that this is a form of bodily reception rather than sensory perception. It's a vague inheritance of the totality within which we are immersed, rather than a clear and distinct discrimination of the details of our environment. He thinks that modern philosophy has focused on the details of our sensory experience, our sensory perception, and neglected bodily feeling. And that when we return our attention to bodily feeling, not only of the sort of vague inheritance of our surrounding environment, but to our own bodily feeling of the continuity of our consciousness, the way that in each occasion of my experience I'm inheriting the past. I have this continuity and this memory of who I am that I identify with, and somehow my bodily functioning provides that memory for me. Not that my memory or my soul is simply located inside my head or my body. Whitehead doesn't view it that way. Really, the whole universe is accomplishing what I would call my consciousness in each moment, right? Because the boundary between my organism and its environment is quite fuzzy. And because nothing is simply present in its isolated location, but in some way includes the entirety of the universe, my conscious experience is the achievement of all of it. But this continuity of consciousness does seem to be sort of intimately tied to this body. And Whitehead will poke fun at modern philosophers for treating the body as a sort of appendage that's not essential to our existence as a mind. Um, this is really the Cartesian inheritance of philosophy. So he'll joke that, in common experience, we never show up at an event and say, "Here I am, and I have brought my body with me." It's like, well, it goes without saying. Um, the mind and the body are not two separate things. They're an expression of the same process. And what Whitehead wants to do is point out that consciousness emphasizes. The consciousness is in the game of emphasis, and it emphasizes by abstracting from the massive basis of our experience, which is embodied, embedded, right, and emotional. There's vague emotions at the base of all of our conscious thoughts, and only rather seldomly do we attend to those vague emotions. And Whitehead thinks that philosophy would be better served if it attended to visceral feelings of vague emotions when it is searching for the fundamental necessities of existence. That if we want to gain access to what's true in general of the universe, we need to go not into the realm of abstraction to come up with a model of a mechanistic universe that obeys imposed laws, but rather we need to go down, we need to descend into our bodily experience to make contact with that fundamental sense of inheriting in each moment our own past, or that fundamental sense of inhabiting a world of purposes that shape our own intentions, that we inherit through our visceral experience. Here's what Whitehead says about this overemphasis by modern philosophers on clear sensory experience over the vague feelings of the body. He says that human nature has been described in terms of its vivid accidents and not of its existential essence. This is from the chapter called Civilized Universe and Modes of Thought. The description of its essence must apply to the unborn child, to the baby in its cradle, to the state of sleep, and to the vast background of feeling hardly touched by consciousness. Clear conscious discrimination is an accident of our human existence. It makes us human, but it does not make us exist. It is of the essence of our humanity, but it is an accident of our existence. What is our primary experience, which lies below and gives its meaning to our conscious analysis of qualitative detail? In our analysis of detail, we are presupposing a background, which supplies a meaning. These vivid accidents accentuate something which is already there. We require to describe that factor in our experience, which, being a matter of course, does not enter prominently into conversation. There is no need to mention it. For this reason, language is very ineffective for the exposition of metaphysics. Our enjoyment of actuality is a realization of worth, good or bad. It is a value experience. Its basic expression is, have a care, here is something that matters. Yes, that is the best phrase. The primary glimmering of consciousness reveals something that matters. This experience provokes attention, dim and all but subconscious. Attention yields a threefold character in the something that matters. There is totality, there is externality, and there is internality. These are the primary characterizations of that which matters. They are not to be conceived as clear analytic concepts. Experience awakes with these dim presuppositions to guide its rising clarity of detailed analysis. They are presuppositions in the sense of expressing the sort of obviousness which experience exhibits. There is the totality of actual fact, There is the externality of many facts. There is the internality of this experiencing, which lies within the totality. These three divisions are on a level. No one in any sense precedes the other. There is the whole fact containing within itself my fact and the other facts. Also, the dim meaning of fact, or actuality, is intrinsic importance for itself, for the others, and for the whole. So Whitehead here directs our attention away from the details that we consciously discriminate in our sensory perception and the concepts kind of derived from that sensory perception. He redirects our attention to the dim background of our consciousness, and he tries to elucidate this threefold character of that sort of massive basis of our experience, right? That's typically unconscious. And he distinguishes this sense of the totality, this sense of those others, and the sense of me, myself, right? And if you're familiar with Ken Wilber, he would describe this in terms of the I realm, the we realm, and the it realm. Um, it's the all, the totality, me, the self, and them, the other. And Whitehead thinks that they're all on the same level. And while like the subjective idealist might overemphasize the me side, some social constructionists would overemphasize the we side, and some materialists might overemphasize the it side. Whitehead wants to integrate all three, and his vision of the universe is in many ways pluralistic, but it's just as much monistic too. Yes, like Parmenides, Whitehead will say that all is one, but yes, like Heraclitus, he will say that all is in flux. And like a thinker like Empedocles, I'll say that there are these, there's a plurality of elements that compose this universe, and we should never rush to reduce everything to oneness, right? There's a way that we can undermine the universe by reducing it to its parts and denying wholeness. And there's a way that we could, as the philosopher Graham Harman puts it, overmine the universe by reducing the individual parts in their uniqueness to the whole. So reductionism goes both ways, right? There's holistic reductionism, and there's reductionism to the parts. I know a few of you are also in my course online, Whitehead's Adventure in Cosmology, so maybe some of this is review. For those of you who have never encountered Whitehead's thought before, I hope I've whet your appetite, and I hope that you can engage with the chapters that I suggested you read for this week's lecture, and get something meaningful out of them. Whitehead is not an easy writer to understand. Many deep philosophers are difficult. It does pay off to reread some of Whitehead's work, though. I've been studying him for many years, and what I love about him is that every time I return to his work, I get something new out of it. There's something living in his way of expressing himself, which at first is difficult. It's difficult to crack the code, so to speak, but once you begin to see between the cracks, yeah, there's a lot of light coming through. And there's a whole new vision of the universe that's lying in wait for us to continue to actualize. We need to carry Whitehead's way of thought forward. I think there are many gifts in his cosmology for our contemporary civilization. And there's plenty that we might want to continue to update, but part of what it means to be a process philosopher is to engage in the adventure of cosmology in an open-ended way, never losing our sense of curiosity, never losing our sense of wonder. Right? Philosophy begins in wonder, and at the end, when philosophy has done its job, the wonder remains. So thanks for listening, and I look forward to engaging in dialogue with all of you in the Canvas discussion forum.